Okay, we've got one or two people that have joined us, waiting for one or two others to join us. But welcome to the Quality Management and Training IATF webinar. If I could ask you to make sure that your cameras and microphones are off and muted, that would be quite helpful, because sometimes we get a bit of feedback over the microphone, so that would help enormously if you could do that. There is a chat button somewhere. It's like a little bubble thing. If you click on that, you can ask questions anytime you like. And what I'll be doing is I'll be jotting those questions down. So at any time, just offer a chat question. I'll jot those questions down, and we'll have a forum at the end where John and I, well, John mainly, attempts to answer those questions for you. So let's have a look. Oh, so John, if I could get you to flick onto the next slide for me, please. Thank you. I think we all know about QM&T. So we've been going since '84, but I think most people are aware of QM&T and what we get up to. So we do support, quality support, health and safety support, environmental support. We do lots of different training courses, and we do support the CQI, IRCA courses as well through our distance learning schemes. So anyway, thanks. Next slide then, please, John. Yeah, so this is the tie-up with IATF and 16949. So there are some courses associated with this information. So if you wanted to get more information about IATF and 16949, there are a number of courses that you can look at. There are no distance learning ones, CQI IRCA ones specifically, except there is one on problem solving and that sort of thing. So if you want more information about it, there are open courses that you can find more information on our website regarding www.qmt.co.uk. So anyway, I just mentioned those to you. Next slide then, please, John. Yeah, this is about me. So yeah. Next slide, please, John.
Okay.
And this is John. Quality Management and Statistics Society of certified black belt, so don't mess with him. Wrote Quality Management Six Sigma book together with some other bloke called Jeff Fawley, and delivery training consultancies to SMEs and multinational groups. Really super bloke in terms of knowledge on all things quality, and particularly all things automotive as well. As he's my go-to man, certainly with regard to all those sorts of issues. Next slide, please, John. So these are the qualifications that CQI IRCA qualifications that are kind of relevant to this session, and there's some information, and you'll get these slides being sent to you anyway. But the information that we've got on this slide is about where there isn't a course specifically for 16949 in terms of IRCA type courses. So what I've done is tried to find the most suitable equivalent to them, which is PT 208, FD 103 and PT 206, for what it's worth, just to say that they are available to us. Right, there's enough of that, I think. So I think it'd be best if John takes over from there. So I think the next slide is down to you, John.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. And as Jeff mentioned, welcome everyone to the webinar, by the way. And as Jeff mentioned, I've been involved mainly with automotive work for the automotive industry for many years. So the aim of this webinar is to provide an overview of the IATF system, particularly for those companies who are seeking to implement the system and to achieve registration. So we're going to look at the background to IATF. Why was it introduced? Who introduced it? The scope of application, who uses it? The structure of the standard, how is it written? What's the format? Some key differences between IATF and ISO 9001. And that will be one of the main themes of the webinar, in fact. And then we'll finish up by looking at some implementation guidelines. So, a few basics. What is IATF 16949? It's a quality management system intended for use globally within the automotive industry. In fact, it could easily be used by other industries because the principles, requirements, the methodology has got a much broader application than simply automotive. But as far as the IATF system is concerned, it's all about the automotive industry. Organisations operating within automotive supply chains are able to achieve third-party certification from the well-known certification bodies, or at least the ones that are approved, if they fulfil the requirements of the standard. Who developed IATF 16949? It's not a new publication, it's not a new system. The original specification was identified rather differently as ISO TS 16949, and that was created in 1999. I've been working with it ever since it was first published. So I've been heavily involved with it, or helping clients to implement the system for the past 20 years. It was written jointly by the International Automotive Task Force, IATF. And they collaborated, they were supported by the International Standards Organization, in particular Technical Committee 176. And I put a footnote on the slide just to explain that. Technical Committee 176 are the committee who are responsible for the ISO 9000 series of standards. So they worked with the automotive industry to create this automotive system. But who are IATF? Well, briefly, they comprise manufacturers and trade associations. But let's have a closer look at the key members on the next slide. On the left-hand side, we have the vehicle manufacturers. These are the top level voting members. And there will be many other vehicle manufacturers and brand names which actually don't appear on that list, but nevertheless are involved with the IATF system. But this is the top level committee. On the right hand side, we've got some of the key associations who support the automotive industry with training, with publications, and help with managing the scheme. Okay. The scope of IATF is fairly broad. Any supply chains related to any of the vehicle types that we can see on the screen are eligible and are probably required in many cases to be registered to the IATF standard. A supplier might only make a single product. They might supply a raw material. If it's used on any of these vehicle types, then they are eligible for IATF registration. However, not all vehicle types are eligible, and the scheme rules are quite specific. The supply chains which are not eligible are now shown on the screen. This includes industrial vehicles like forklift trucks, agricultural vehicles like farm tractors, off-highway vehicles such as excavators, and aftermarket parts, which are spare parts that we might buy for from a retail store, which are not necessarily the approved genuine parts. So there is a very clear line of demarcation as to who is eligible and who is not. And if we consider the scope a little bit further, for the eligible supply chains, let's look at the types of activities which are within scope. First of all, design and development, but it must be part of a manufacturing organisation. So here we have a difference with ISO 9001, because a design and development organisation can't achieve standalone certification to IATF. They have to be part of a manufacturing organisation. They don't have to be located on the same site as the manufacturing organisation. In fact, they could be in a completely different country, but they have to be part of the manufacturing organisation. The reason being is that IATF is very much a manufacturing focused standard, unlike ISO 9001, which is rather more general. There is a fairly new addition to the scope. This was introduced in 2016. Products with embedded software are now within the scope of IATF. They have to be subject to quality assurance as well as tangible manufactured products. And of course, in the future, embedded software will be used even more extensively as electric vehicles take over from conventional vehicles. So this software is already a key part of vehicle quality, and that is going to expand in the future. So it needs to be done correctly. It needs to work correctly. Now we come to the main focus of IATF, which is manufacturing and assembly operations. To be registered, an organisation must manufacture at least one product, or they must assemble at least one product. So they might fit two parts together, and perhaps that's all they do, but that qualifies them for IATF registration if those parts are going to be fitted into a vehicle. Finishing processes are also included, such as painting, plating, heat treatment. They might be carried out by the organisation or maybe by a subcontractor, but they are within scope. Installation or servicing. Not all organisations carry out these activities, but if they do, they have to be included within the system. And also subcontractors should be included. There is a lot of emphasis on an organisation developing its own suppliers along the lines of IATF. So the aim is that it will, the vision is that it will be applied throughout the supply chain. And that process has been steadily going on for the past 20 years. The key goals of the IATF system originally were, and they still are, as follows: to incorporate continual improvement, to emphasise defect prevention, to reduce variation and waste in the automotive supply chain. There is a lot of emphasis on an organisation managing its processes to achieve these goals. If we have a process which does not perform correctly or errors occur, it means the requirements might not be met. And the effects can be quite serious sometimes. They might include loss of customer satisfaction, safety issues, non-compliance with laws and regulations. And usually there's a cost, often a large cost, to resolve these issues: warranty claims, internal cost, etc. And this is exactly what the automotive industry want to avoid within their supply chains. And this is one of the key aims of IATF, to avoid these undesirable effects. So how do we do that? Well, there are key planning tools which are incorporated within the system. An organisation that design the product are expected to carry out a design risk analysis, which very often will be a design failure mode and effects analysis. The aim is to make sure that the design is fit for purpose and it's also robust. It's possible to make the parts to that design. And then when the design is handed over to the manufacturing organisation, they have to plan their manufacturing processes. So this will typically involve a process flow chart, and for each step of the process flow, there will be a risk analysis in the form of a process FMEA. What could go wrong at each step, and what do we do to control the process and avoid these problems? A very key document within the IATF system is the next level down, the control plan. This lists all of the controls within the process flow which are aimed at managing risks and ensuring that everything is done correctly. And there will usually be an even more detailed level of documents, work instructions, visual aids, standard operations. This information helps process personnel to understand what's required and achieve the correct results. So the focus very much is on designing quality into products and processes rather than trying to sort out problems when things go wrong. So it's very much a preventive approach. I'd like to look now at the link with ISO 9001. ISO 9001 is in fact the foundation of the IATF system. The IATF system requires that 9001 is implemented in its entirety. Furthermore, IATF have adopted the structure of Annex SL. We'll have a look at this on the next slide. This is basically the ISO format for standards. IATF have incorporated the additional automotive requirements within the ISO structure. So let's have a look at Annex SL. Now, this is a format which was introduced by the International Standards Organization for all new and revised management standards. It comprises 10 standard sections, which will appear in all management standards. And the aim is that the standards will have a consistent look and feel about them and be easier for organisations to use and implement. IATF have followed the same 10-section structure, and they have incorporated the automotive requirements within this structure. Now, within this webinar, and in fact, when we implement the system, we're particularly interested in sections 4 through to 10, because these are the sections that include the requirements, the specified mandatory things that an organisation has to do to achieve registration. Formally, IATF is regarded as a supplement to 9001, not the other way around, but that's a rather academic point. The two standards are published as individual documents, hence it's necessary for an organisation to have access to both standards for quality management purposes. And it's probably worth mentioning that the ISO 9000 requirements are not actually shown within the IATF document. They're only referenced. So the two manual format, as IATF call it, is necessary for implementation. Let's have a look at that structure in a little bit more detail, because in fact there is rather more to be aware of. Here we can see the two standards that we've just been discussing, 9001 and IATF. However, there is more, because the IATF document has already been supplemented with updates. And these are published by IATF in the form of something called sanctioned interpretations. And we're going to look at that in more detail in a moment, but this is a key part of the system. So there are now 3 documents that we need to be aware of to implement the system. However, there is likely to be even more. As applicable, and often it is applicable, documents which are published by automotive supply chain customers, and these are called customer specific requirements, and these add even more detail to the IATF scheme. There are things that customers want doing in a way that is very particular to them. We'll have a look at that in a bit more detail in a moment. Also, in many cases, there will be additional reference manuals involved. These manuals typically are not published by IATF. They're published by the industry organisations who support IATF, and they cover topics such as the core tools. And they go into more detail than is provided by the standard. These again contain information which is often considered mandatory. So we can see that the scheme is actually, the system is actually quite broad. Let's have a look now in a bit more detail at the sanctioned interpretations. The IATF standard is subject to updates as the need arises. So unlike an international standard, it's not it's not constrained by revisions every several years. The automotive industry intend to maintain the standard on an ongoing basis. And in fact, sanctioned interpretations are typically issued every year. A sanctioned interpretation changes a requirement. It's particularly important to be aware of. Organisations are expected to update their system as necessary to ensure compliance with any changes. An SI becomes an auditable requirement, and it can form the basis of a non-conformity. Sanctioned interpretations can be downloaded from the IATF website. It's very easy to do. There's no registration required. There's no cost required. Anybody can visit the website and download a PDF version of the changes, and it is important to do that and to keep up to date with these changes. IATF also publish frequently asked questions on their website. An FAQ provides clarification of an existing requirement. It tries to explain what is meant if industry are uncertain. It might not necessarily require action by an organisation. Since IATF, or the current document, was published in 2016, 4 years ago, there have been 19 sanctioned interpretations issued and 29 frequently asked questions. So there has been a lot of updating activity by IATF carried out. Okay. I'm going to try to summarise some of the key areas of difference with ISO 9001 using this table. On the left, we have ISO. On the right, we have IATF. In ISO, there are 66 clauses. In IATF, there are an additional 102 clauses. In ISO, there are 132 mandatory requirements in sections 4 through to 10. In IATF, there are an additional 284 mandatory requirements. In ISO, there is one explicit requirement for a process, which is design and development. In IATF, there are 34 explicit requirements for a process. 21 of them must be documented. As I mentioned, there is a lot of emphasis on processes. In ISO, there are 27 requirements for documented information. This includes documents like work instructions, data, records, plans. In IATF, there are an additional 46 requirements for documented information. So what this conveys to us is that the differences between ISO and IATF are actually quite significant. IATF is not simply a small change or a small adjustment to ISO. It is a very significant, there are very significant differences. It's a big step up. There are a number of enhancements. It's much more rigorous. What I'm planning to show on the next several slides are some of these key areas of difference in a bit more detail. This is going to be only a very brief summary of major differences. There will be a lot of things which are not covered, so it is necessary to refer to the IATF document for full details. But let's have a brief look at sections 4 through to 10. Let's have a brief look at some of the major areas of difference. Starting with section 4, context of the organisation. This is where customer-specific requirements are mandated. They have to be included within the organisation's quality system and audit programme. We'll have a look in a little bit more detail at customer-specific requirements in a moment. Section 4 also requires that every supplier has a documented process for product safety. So any products linked to safety, any manufacturing processes that are involved in safety-related products, they will be within the scope of this process. But there has to be a process within the system. Let's look now at what customer-specific requirements actually refers to. Unfortunately, this is a rather confusing area. IATF have tried to explain it. This is their definition. A CSR is an interpretation or a supplemental requirement to a specific clause of the IATF standard. This is where an automotive customer has explained to their suppliers that they want the standard interpreted in a certain way and used in a certain way when supplying that particular customer. However, there is another term that's used within the standard which is similar but different. Customer requirements. IATF tell us that these are all of the requirements specified by a customer: technical, commercial, process related, terms and conditions, and CSRs. So the customer specifics are in fact part of this more general term of customer requirements. So it is quite confusing. Going back to customer specifics, these relate directly to the IATF standard. They're not specific for individual suppliers. These apply to all suppliers who supply that customer. So they could be considered to be supplier quality assurance requirements. They're really a type of supplier quality manual. They don't go into details of product dimensions and features. That would be customer requirements. CSRs have a very high status within the system. There has to be a system for managing them and ensuring that they're implemented and audited. CSRs can be issued by any supply chain customer, although in practice it tends to be the higher levels of organisation who have published most of the customer specifics. Moving on to section 5, leadership. There has to be a policy or policies for corporate responsibility. This is an example of where the IATF standard goes beyond quality. There are other important elements that are included. Top management must identify process owners. So again, we have the focus on processes, and top management must review the processes for effectiveness and efficiency to make sure they're working and waste is minimized. And there is a lot of emphasis on monitoring and measurement of process performance. And if a process is not performing to expectations, it is expected that action is taken to address that concern. This approach is summarised or emphasised within IATF as the process approach. So it's all about process management. Section 6, planning. Another very key theme is lessons learned and risk-based thinking. This is a very key theme in ISO 9001, but it is also enhanced by IATF. And in fact, there are 33 clauses in sections 4 to 10 relating to risk, but some of the most direct requirements appear in section 6. IATF require preventive action in clause 6122. Now, this requirement was actually dropped by ISO 9001 in the 2015 edition, but IATF have retained it. Also, IATF require contingency plans in clause 6123. This is sometimes referred to as business continuity or disaster recovery. And the aim is that the supplier will be able to continue to supply their automotive customers if they experience a significant disruption, which could be an event such as a flood, a power cut, a fire. It's important they've considered this risk and have a backup to ensure that their customers can continue to be supplied. Section 7, support. Here we have another of the core tools, measurement systems analysis, MSA. This is mandatory. It's not mentioned in ISO 9001. There are extended requirements for calibration And there are requirements for the qualification of laboratories. If, for example, an organisation uses services of an external laboratory for activities such as calibration, testing, inspection, there are certain expectations regarding the qualification of those laboratories. A typical example would be laboratory certification to the ISO 17025 standard, as an example. Now we have another requirement within IATF, which is not directly a quality requirement, but closely related. It is expected that the organisation motivate and empower employees. The aim is to engage employees to achieve quality requirements, understand customer requirements, and also to help to implement improvements within their processes. This might include things like suggestion schemes or continual improvement activities. Now we have another example of a requirement that has been retained by IATF but dropped by ISO 9001. IATF still requires that a documented quality manual is included in the system. Next, section 8. Now, this is a very big section in the IATF system. In fact, I have actually got 2 slides to summarise this. It is a really big section, and this is where most of the mainstream activities occur, from design, taking the customer's order, design, manufacturing the product, purchasing, making the product, packaging it, shipping it. All of the key activities fall within section 8. A manufacturing feasibility review is required. This is really an extension to the existing contract review, but it's much more rigorous and it focuses in a lot more detail at the manufacturing requirements, particularly if there are new or modified requirements compared with what an organisation has previously been involved with. Anything that's new is considered a risk. A project management process is required. A possible example is one of the core tools, advanced product quality planning, but that's not mandatory. However, there has to be some process for introducing products and processes, and only product design can be excluded from the scope of the system. Every organisation registered to IATF is responsible for design, for the design of their manufacturing processes. However, not all suppliers are responsible for product design. So where appropriate, that is the only thing that can be excluded from the formal scope of certification. A multidisciplinary approach is emphasised. Many of the activities within IATF require a multidisciplinary approach, such as FMEAs, control plans, the organisation of the work area, the manufacturing feasibility review that we mentioned. Many of these activities have to be carried out by a cross-functional team involving more than one person. A process for software quality assurance is now required if the organisation supply products with embedded software, or if they procure products from suppliers with embedded software. Special characteristics must be defined. This is one of the key focuses of attention during the planning and manufacturing stages. A special characteristic is something that is particularly important to get right. It's typically associated with a product or a manufacturing process, and it's something which needs to be properly controlled, or it could lead to serious issues. It's basically a risk factor that normally attracts particular attention to ensure that it is properly completed. Moving on, staying with section 8, we move on to the next slide. There are enhanced requirements for supplier management. most of the supplier quality requirements appear in clauses beginning with 8.4, and there are a lot more requirements for suppliers that appear in ISO 9001. A documented total preventive maintenance system is required, and also there is a separate requirement for tooling management, which has a similar theme. A process FMEA and control plan are considered particularly important core tools, and they're mandatory for the manufacturing operations. Production part approval after planning is completed and before production starts must comply with customer requirements. Often, but not always, this will be one of the core tools, PPAP, production part approval process, but automotive customers typically have their own requirements for PPAP in many cases. Control of changes has to be properly managed. Change is considered to be risk. Any change to the product, the process, the manufacturing location, anything that could affect the conformity of the product, those changes have to be evaluated and approved before they're implemented. And sometimes that will involve other stakeholders, such as the customer. There are enhanced controls in section 8.7 for non-conforming outputs. This again is a lot more rigorous than ISO 9001. The automotive industry is very concerned about non-conforming items re-entering the supply chain and being incorporated into vehicles. So there are some very rigorous controls directed at non-conforming or even suspect outputs. Now we move to section 9, performance, which is a very brief section, but there are some very key activities included. The use of statistical methods has to be determined during planning. There is no direct reference in IATF to the core tools SPC, statistical process control, but it is implied. The standard uses the term control and process capability. So that implies that SPC may be appropriate. Sometimes it isn't, but often it is. There are enhanced requirements for internal audits. We'll have a brief look at that in a moment. There are expanded requirements for management review. So we'll look at that also. Audit requirements. There are a lot of additional requirements, 12 in fact, that IATF have introduced over and above ISO 9001. ISO has just 2 clauses shown at the top of the screen for internal audit. IATF has added an additional 12 clauses for audit activities. And in fact, to section 9, even though that is the main section, they are in fact scattered throughout sections 7 and 8 as well. Okay, let's have a look at some of these additional requirements. IATF requires 3 types of internal audit to be carried out. A system audit, which are processes like planning, like sales, like purchasing. Manufacturing process audits, literally in the manufacturing areas, having a detailed look at the control of the manufacturing process. And product audits, which focus on verifying that the products are in fact correctly classified, particularly if they've been deemed acceptable. Occasionally we will double check them to confirm that they really are acceptable. The process approach must be used. Yet again, we have the emphasis on process management. IATF recommend the use of something called the turtle diagram. A very simple example is shown on the right side of the screen. This is simply a template or a format that help the organisation to understand the key elements of process management. It's very useful to auditors, but it's not mandatory. However, compliance audits are not acceptable, and the compliance audit is the rather traditional procedures type audit, which some organisations refer to as tick box audits, where an auditor bases their audit on the clauses of a procedure or a standard. IATF do not accept that as adequate. They feel they require that the entire process must be considered. All of the key elements of process management need to be included. Inputs, outputs, risk management, continual improvement, people who are involved, resources, infrastructure, and very importantly, the performance, the key performance measures. So that goes beyond a typical compliance audit. The key job of the auditor, the essential outcome, is to develop a statement of process performance. Is the process that's been audited meeting requirements or not, or partly? A priority for the auditor is to seek evidence that the process is operating as planned and is meeting requirements. If the performance is not meeting requirements, the auditor will seek evidence of investigation and appropriate corrective action. So that is really the most important outcome of an internal audit. Management review has been greatly enhanced. ISO 9001, for example, requires 13 specific inputs to be reviewed by management. That's quite a long list. However, IATF add an additional 12 requirements for inputs. So if we add 12 to 13, there are in fact 25 inputs or topics or agenda items that now have to be reviewed at least annually by management. So there are a lot of things that have to be reviewed to satisfy the IATF system. Section 10, the last section, another brief section. A documented process for problem solving is required. There is no specific problem solving process mandated. There may be customer specific requirements. Some customers require their suppliers to use specific processes, such as, for example, the 8 discipline process. Error proofing or poka-yoke is strongly emphasised. There are in fact 4 clauses that refer to this. We'll have a look at one of the main clauses on the next slide. There has to be a process for warranty management, but only if an organisation has a warranty management agreement, a formal agreement with the customer. And there are extended requirements for continual improvement. Error proofing, clause 10.2.4, poka-yoke. There has to be a documented process that describes how an organisation determine where error proofing should be implemented. The method used must be documented in the process FMEA and the control plan. Error proofing devices must be tested periodically. Typically that would be done at the start of each shift or production run to make sure that they are working correctly. So that brings us to the end of the walkthrough of the key sections of the standard. I'd like to finish up now by looking at some of the administrative and implementation aspects. The scheme rules determine the third-party certification process. This is controlled by IATF. The requirements are specified in yet another document, rules for achieving and maintaining recognition, and the certification bodies who are authorised to issue certificates are required to follow these rules. And as with the IATF standard itself, there are updates published. There are sanctioned interpretations and frequently asked questions. The scheme rules are particularly important to the certification bodies, but it's useful for organisations to be aware of them. An organisation that wished to implement the IATF system could do well to follow these guidelines. Confirm eligibility and define the intended scope of the system. What's going to be in, what's going to be out? How much of our product is automotive? How much of it is not automotive? Do we want the scheme to cover everything, or do we want it to cover only automotive products. Conduct a gap analysis, compare the current system, if there is one, with the IATF requirements. Develop an action plan for implementation, which involves all process owners. All of the organisation, or most of the organisation, will need to be involved in managing their area of the system. Provide training for all relevant personnel, including internal auditor training. Clause 723, internal auditor competency, is very prescriptive about the competency of internal auditors. Carry out a complete cycle of internal audits to determine conformity with the IATF requirements and address any areas of non-conformity or non-compliance. So this would be done when the organisation consider that they are ready for third-party certification. Conduct a management review to determine readiness and ensure that performance data for the past 12 months is available, including internal audits. These 2 bullet points are a prerequisite to certification. So it's mandatory to have carried out this complete cycle. It's mandatory to have conducted a management review. The certification body won't be able to begin the certification process without that having been done. The stage 1 assessment is the first step, which is essentially a desktop audit, and subject to that being completed satisfactorily, the organisation can go on to the main stage 2 assessment, when the organisation look at in more detail at all areas of the system, and this has to take place within 90 days of the stage 1. Otherwise, the whole process has to start over again. Benefits of achieving certification: promotes defect prevention. There is a lot of emphasis on continual improvement in clause 10.3.1. It provides recognition that an organisation has implemented a system which meets the requirements of the automotive industry. It helps to demonstrate to customers and potential customers the capability of the organisation, and this may enable access to new business opportunities. And if an organisation wants to become involved in supplying the automotive industry, it's very likely that IATF 16949 will be a prerequisite to realising that opportunity. This brings us to the end of the presentation slides. So I'm just going to summarise what we've covered in the webinar. We've looked at the background to IATF. We've looked at the scope, what's in, what's out. We've looked at the structure. We've looked at the key differences between IATF and ISO, and we've just looked at some implementation guidelines. So I'd now like to hand you back to Jeff. In a moment, Jeff will be facilitating some questions. So hopefully there will be some questions for us to tackle. So I'm going to hand back to Jeff now.
Thanks, John. Thanks very much for that. That was really good. Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, just to remind you that there are these courses available if you want to know more about IATF. Is there another slide beyond this, John? I can't remember.
Yes, we have.
Yeah, and so if you've got any questions about IATF or anything else associated quality-wise that you feel you want to pose or find out some information, you can use that the email address there or the website that you can see there. Okay, regarding questions then, John, right, what do Japanese manufacturers use with regard to this?
Well, that's a good question. They seem to prefer their own individual systems. So, for example, the Toyota production system is recognised as an exemplar automotive system in its own right. Now, having said that, the Japanese manufacturers do recognise and support the IATF system, and in fact, although they're not part of the voting membership, they have actually contributed to the requirements of the standard. And became involved in edition 2 in 2002, but they've made their contributions through their trade association, which is JAMA, the Japan Automobile Manufacturers Association, and that comprises 14 Japanese vehicle manufacturers, which include all of the well-known names that we're familiar with. So they seem to prefer their own systems. They don't mandate that their suppliers achieve IATF registration, but they're very supportive of it and they recognise it.
In that, you mentioned the Toyota manufacturing system. Is that anything to do with lean?
Very much so. And in fact, a lot of the IATF requirements link to lean and I believe have their origins in the Toyota production system. IATF has a requirement in clause 7131, which is plant and facility layout and planning, and it says that it's not a mandatory requirement, it's a note, and it says that lean manufacturing principles should be adopted.
You mentioned Pokey Oak, John. Could you, what's that all about?
It's error proofing. This again originated or was developed by Toyota, and the aim is that when we design a process, when we carry out our risk analysis, our FMEA, we should consider what could go wrong. And once we recognise that potential, depending on the level of risk and the impact, we might want to make that process design so robust that an error could not occur. And that may be error proofing or preventing human errors, or it could be non-human errors that could occur. And typically error proofing devices are non-human devices of various types that will prevent an error condition. They will stop the process. In some cases, it involves very effective and high-tech monitoring devices like cameras, sensors, but it could be physical devices. The aim is that the error basically can't happen and it can't move forward. So it adopts the Toyota principle of Jidoka, no defects forward.
So it's not just like foolproofing, that's kind of obvious. It's a bit of a scientific approach then, is Pokey Oak then, is it?
The scope of Pokey Oak devices is very broad. It can be very simple devices. It can be very high-tech devices. Some methods are rather more passive than others. The very best types of Pokey Oak device are those that physically prevent the cause from occurring, so that a non-conforming product simply can't be made. However, some devices allow an error condition to occur, but they find it immediately, resulting in prompt action.
So Pokey Oak is not just foolproofing, it's a methodology and it's a scientific approach.
It is, yes. Yeah. And there are gurus associated with that, like Shigeo Shingo, for example.
Sneaky question for you. Could you show us an example of a turtle diagram? That's probably a bit too much for you to do. I've got one here at the moment. If you'd like to let me share the screen and yes. I can put mine up.
Yes.
Okay, let me do that then. So let me just minimize that. And I hope this works. So let me just try and share my screen. And I'll let John talk over this. So I'm hoping that can you see my screen?
Yes.
John, could you talk over that? I think that's not the best example of a turtle diagram, but it's the only one I've got.
No, that's absolutely fine, actually. There are a variety of formats of turtle diagram, and different organizations have their own formats, but this is actually a very typical example. A turtle diagram is simply a method that helps to prompt the organization to consider all of the key aspects of process management. And it's useful to auditors, and it's also useful to explain the process itself. So it's a useful tool for the process owner to have available. There is no specific sequence in populating or using this template. However, the key areas, starting in the middle, the key areas are the process activities. What process is it? It could be sales, it could be design, it could be manufacturing. All processes fit to the turtle diagram. The inputs are the head of the turtle. And this is the information, the materials. This is what goes into the process. The outputs are what the process produces and passes on to a customer, whether it's an internal or external customer. The deliverables, and that might be information, it might be products, it might be finished products, it might be part finished. Surrounding that, we have the key areas of process management. In the top left-hand corner, we have the infrastructure. This will include equipment, facilities, software. In the middle, we have customer-specific requirements. These should be included within the turtle diagram. They're a key part of the system. In the top right-hand corner, we have typically people resources. This will include the managers, the team leaders, the process personnel, the work movers, anyone who is involved in operating this process. Moving to the bottom left-hand corner, how? These are the controls. They may be physical controls, like error-proofing devices, like software controls, or they could be key documents like work instructions, FMEAs, and so on. Support processes. These are processes which link to the main process that's being studied. So if we were studying a manufacturing process on the turtle diagram, key support processes are likely to include maintenance, calibration, etc. In the bottom right-hand panel, this is regarded as the most important area of the process, the way that it is monitored or measured. This is how the process owner determines whether their process is working correctly, is it meeting the required standards. This is where KPIs or key performance indicators will appear, but not every process will have a KPI. Many processes will have compliance metrics. Are we meeting our own schedules and plans? Is the maintenance process on schedule? Is the calibration process? It's the method of determining the performance, and it's one of the key things that auditors and certification bodies will focus on. So that is actually a very typical example of the turtle diagram. Not mandatory, but it is recommended.
Thanks, John. Could you pop the last slide back up again for me, please, if that's possible, to share your screen? Don't worry if not. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for attending. I hope you found that useful. As always, if you've got any questions, drop them to the addresses that you can see on the screen at the moment. You will be getting copies of this slide, and it has been recorded as well. So that will be available on our website as well. Thank you all very much. Goodbye.